My name is Owene Courtney, and I'm the Director of Formation and Spirituality at St. John's Cathedral in Jacksonville, Florida. Today, we are honored to have two very special guests to lead us in conversation about truth and reconciliation in our country. Our guests are J. Chester Johnson, poet, essayist, and translator, and author of the recently published book, Damaged Heritage, the Elaine Race Massacre, and a Story of Reconciliation. Chester will be joined in conversation by Dr. Catherine Meeks, who is the Executive Director of the Absalom Jones Episcopal Center for Racial Healing in Atlanta. Chester is a longtime friend of Bishop John Howard, the bishop of this diocese, and he was with us at the cathedral several years ago speaking about the translation of the Psalms, which he did for the 1979 prayer book. Dr. Meeks was also at the cathedral just a few months ago, though it seems like a year ago, as part of the celebration of Absalom Jones Day. We are so very grateful to both of them for joining us to begin our truth and reconciliation conversations. As you've entered this Zoom call, you should be muted, but if not, please make sure you are muted so that there won't be any background noise. We will begin with about 15 minutes of Chester telling the story of how he came to write his book, Damaged Heritage, followed by 30 minutes or so of conversation between Chester and Dr. Meeks. And that should leave about 20 minutes for your questions and answers. As you listen, if you would leave questions in the chat box on your screen, we will be able to answer as many of them as possible.
Welcome, everyone. We're so grateful that you're here today, and we hope that this is just the beginning of many conversations, truth and reconciliation conversations that we'll be engaging in at the cathedral and hopefully throughout the city of Jacksonville and this country. But before we begin to hear these words of wisdom from Chester and Catherine, why don't we open ourselves with a prayer today. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Almighty and eternal God, in Holy Scripture you show us that healing takes generations, that sin is not only contained within a person, but within a whole ancestral line. In Holy Scripture you give us these genealogies that take us down centuries, showing how one generation impacts another. And in this country, we are just beginning to awaken to the depth of the sin of racism and its ramifications that affect all of us. We thank you for these two voices of courage that we will hear this morning. Open our hearts and minds as we listen to their wisdom, that it may change us so that the generations to come may be changed. This we pray in the name of Jesus, your Son. Amen.
Amen. So am I supposed to take it away?
Take it away, Chester. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, good morning. I'm J. Chester Johnson, and I'm delighted to talk with you via Zoom about my latest book, Damaged Heritage, the Elaine Race Massacre, and a Story of Reconciliation. Damaged Heritage was very recently, on May the 5th, published by Pegasus with distribution by Simon & Schuster. I'm doubly thrilled to be on the same program with one of my heroes, Dr. Catherine Meeks. She and I were on the program together at the dedication ceremonies for the Elaine Massacre Memorial in Arkansas, late September 2019. And I'm so pleased we're together today in connection with this book. How I hope in recognition of the inhuman and cavalier manner by which George Floyd met his death. How I hope we are indeed at a determinative inflection point for Black liberation and Black equality, particularly by our American justice system. But alas, what do we do about that 40% plus of Americans who support this president and the relatedly racist policies that emanate from this administration? How I hope this is indeed a determinative inflection point, for when I lie down the last time, I fear that I will once again be reminded of the constant and consistent reality of unrelenting onslaughts in this country by the forces of racism. As I think back, it probably all began for me with the mutilation and murder of Emmett Till when I was 10, living only 2 hours away by car from Money, Mississippi, where his life was taken. That consciousness on race issues was broadened sharply and shortly thereafter with the Montgomery bus boycott and the equivalent of trench warfare by agents of racism, continued resistance to Black liberation ever after, decade upon decade. The book, Damaged Heritage, is not necessarily meant to provide insights into that historical span of time, though there are threads that run in that direction. But rather, Damaged Heritage is meant to offer possibilities for achieving racial comity, freedom for both American Blacks and whites, racial reconciliation, friendship, and indeed love. As we walk through the messages and contours of this book, I wish to underscore a crucial fact. Maybe I sound like I just left the Mississippi River Delta, though I've lived in New York City for many decades. Or maybe parts of the presentation sound apropos of headline Southern experience. But please do not assume this is a Southern book. It is not. While the South may carry a more glaring history of damaged heritage and its effects on racial subjugation, let us not be misled. Damaged heritage is a national problem, and wherever its use by whites against African Americans exists, then this book applies. I was asked to write the Litany of Offense and Apology for the National Day of Repentance, October the 4th, 2008, when the Episcopal Church formally apologized, with the presiding bishop officiating, for its role in transatlantic slavery and related evils. As I conducted my research, I came across a 70-page treatise entitled The Arkansas Race Riot of 1919, written by the African-American historian and anti-lynching advocate Ida B. Wells. It told of a terrible slaughter of Black sharecroppers and their family members, possibly the worst attack against African Americans in our country's history, with over 100 and possibly hundreds of Blacks perishing in Phillips County, located in southeast Arkansas along the Mississippi River Delta. I grew up in southeast Arkansas, one county removed from the site of the massacre. None of my friends nor I ever knew a thing about this terrible event. I never heard about it at school, in social gatherings, at church. As I was to discover, for virtually everyone in the United States, the Elaine race massacre didn't exist as a murderous act in American history. Partially out of sheer anger that I had been duped by the evanescence of uncomfortable history, I began to examine attacks in southeast Arkansas against African Americans around the time of the Elaine race massacre after the end of World War I, and found that there had been lynchings and burnings of Blacks alive in the area, but none of these horrific and pernicious actions resulted in the 100+ deaths that occurred in the Elaine race massacre. I also began to recall a crucial personal story my mother told me many years before about my maternal grandfather, Lonnie Birch, the principal caretaker during the first 5 years of my life. She told me that when she was young, not yet a teenager, Lonnie, who had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, participated in what she called a well-known race riot where many blacks were killed in southeast Arkansas. Over time, I concluded that the Elaine race massacre and the well-known race riot my mother relayed to me about my grandfather were one and the same. 5 years after the Episcopal Church apologized for its role in slavery and related evils, I wrote a 10,000-word article for a literary magazine on the massacre, which started a journey to reconciliation and deep friendship with Sheila Walker, a descendant of African Americans who were victims of the conflagration in Phillips County. Sheila wrote the foreword to Damaged Heritage. At that time, I also learned something disturbing about myself through the writing of that article. Notwithstanding the preponderance of facts and evidence that Lonnie had participated in the massacre, I used the term likely to describe his role. I had no excuse to use the ameliorative word likely. My use of the term likely ultimately caused me to explore ways white Americans have frequently reacted to their collective and individual damaged heritage that has brought subjugation to blacks over generations and several centuries. As a result of this personal challenge, I came to uncover the ability of generations of whites to tolerate the terrible treatment of blacks in America. I acknowledged my attempt, as so many American whites, especially large numbers of white Southerners, had done before me, to lessen the effects of damaged heritage for the perpetrators. White folks have shielded themselves from damaged heritage through the adoption of an excessive veneration of ancestors, the past, and traditions, a feature Webster calls filiopietism. Both damaged heritage and filiopietism taken together are serious components of long-term and continuing racism. In fact, the influence of damaged heritage on white racism bears little potent capability without the psychological cover from filiopietism, which has excused, camouflaged, and sufficiently inoculated damaged heritage throughout the entirety of our national history. We humans are not born with racism as a natural result of who we innately are. Rather, it is a trait we absorb as a condition of what we learn and have to unlearn if we are to free ourselves from this evil. I like to think that the commonality between all humans, let's call this commonality the genuinely human, far outweighs any differences in custom, history, background, skin color, accents, language, manners, and rituals. Unfortunately, meager differences in these facets between us have often suggested to many whites the perfect reason for exclusion, separation, and isolation of others. With the genuinely human in mind, I recall comments for guidance from the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who wrote 170 years ago that one generation does not learn anything genuinely human from a past generation. In other words, we have to learn ever anew for ourselves the genuinely human. It certainly proved to be a remedy leading to the last 6 years of my reconciliation and friendship with Sheila Walker, descendant of Elaine victims. Kierkegaard's view that one generation cannot rely on a previous generation to learn the genuinely human warns us that filiopietism must and will inevitably embrace racism, at least in white America's case, since that revered past cast African Americans in a perpetual state of human subjugation. Therefore, we whites have to be especially careful today about those traditions to which we adhere, for if we're not, they will surely, as they have in the past, contain racist experience and justification brought forward again and again. I believe that my forebears, and probably most all white forebears in similar circumstances, realized the evil and sin they were committing. In fact, I don't think most American whites over generations could tolerate imposing the subjugation and severe repression that they inflicted on African Americans throughout the application of damaged heritage. Only the inoculation and remarkable cover provided by filial pietism allowed such subjugation and repression to continue. Of course, excessive veneration and adherence to the past do not just exist in the South, though we Northerners have often preferred to think of it that way. It's also allocated in all white churches, in local judicial, economic, and political systems biased against African Americans, and simply in the rooted ways that things have been. And yet, we whites do not comprehend what our racism against African Americans in all of its various forms has done to us and taken from us. Indeed, the greatest American filial pietist of them all, William Faulkner, who brought past mythologies current as much as anyone, and who coined the phrase, "The past is never dead, it's not even past," saw the terrible connection and impact of damaged heritage and filial pietism, writing, quote, "No man can cause as much grief as that one clinging blindly to the vices of his ancestors," close quote. Are there traditions that we now blindly adopt for ourselves that directly or indirectly endorse racism and thus project their power and existence for tomorrow? We should nonetheless feel eagerly challenged that we alone can open ourselves to the genuinely human, not bound by those who come before, and certainly not binding us to past racism. Since Lonnie remained for me divided between my beloved grandfather and a person who participated in the massacre, Sheila proved to be a godsend. She circumvented my struggles with the riven composite of Lonnie's two personas by announcing, both publicly in groups like this one and privately to my family and me, that she forgave Lonnie more than I had. By forgiving Lonnie for his role in the Phillips County conflagration that produced attacks against her victimized ancestors, she deflated the potency of the damaged part of my tradition. Still, notwithstanding the acknowledged power of forgiveness, we whites aren't so much into forgiveness, even the acceptance of forgiveness, which I believe is necessary for racial reconciliation. But we always knew within ourselves that we whites could only be cleansed by those we had made our victims, black brothers and sisters among us. By so many measures, we whites must depend on African Americans to help guide us in a direction that will also allow us to forgive the what and who that have defined us in ways we often do not yet admit, and for so many, unfortunately, still choose to admire. More particularly, the use of forgiveness elevates African Americans and at the same time releases whites to be free of their traditional commissions, to turn whites from their historical inheritance and participation in evil. I've occasionally let myself lean into the following possibilities. What if we whites allowed ourselves to pursue and fully embrace the genuinely human, accepting the commonality of all human beings, superseding and obviating those marginal facets, such as accents, skin color, customs, and the like, that American whites have used to segregate themselves from blacks? If all of that could happen, shouldn't we be able to mitigate, if not suppress, the long-living influence of filial pietism with its excessive reverence for ancestors, the past, and tradition? And if that were to happen, how could damaged heritage survive from generation to generation? And if we could add a little forgiveness, exercised by African Americans, the equivalent of what Martin Luther King Jr. called the weapon of love. And if we whites could accept that forgiveness from African Americans, the kind of forgiveness that Sheila showed Lonnie, or the kind of forgiveness that the families of those killed at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston showed to the white killer Dylan Roof, isn't it possible that, dare I say it, we can contemplate something beyond, something over the mountaintop in visions like those of King and Isaiah that speak gently to us all about one to another, black to white and white to black? Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here with all of you this morning and to be here with my fellow Arkansan Chester as well, and to have a chance to talk about actually the geographic area that we shared in common, but didn't know it until we met a few years back. And I never heard this story either of the Elaine massacre when I lived in Arkansas. I grew up, went to school, graduated from high school, and left there, and that story was never ever told. And so, Chester, I'm so thankful that you have brought this story not only to life, but that it's getting such a wonderful reception from people. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about why you called this book Damaged Heritage.
Well, Catherine, thank you for asking that. Well, as I wrote the book, there were 2 or 3 common phrases and terms that were constant throughout the book. Damaged heritage was one, the genuinely human, filial pietism. And as I, over time, as I kept revising and reviewing the manuscript, damaged heritage just jumped out at me on a continuing basis, because what I meant it to mean in terms of this book is that damaged heritage is an essential part of our white racism, consisting of the legacy, the evidence passed from one generation to another of ingrained prejudicial traditions and customs, sometimes codified into law. And historically, these have been combined with, not infrequent, gratuitous and severe violence and repression that's been perpetrated by American whites against African Americans. And you take that as sort of an umbrella statement of what it is, and you see how the pieces come together. It just kept coming back to me. And in the, sometimes in the wee hours of the morning, I'd also like to I thought a very good title before. But as I said, in the wee hours of the morning, this would happen. The damaged heritage would just sort of pop out at me. as a possible title. And the literary agent for this book and I had lunch one day, and he said, you know, I like the title that you've given to this book, but have you ever thought about calling this Damaged Heritage? And so it just sort of fell in place after that. We all of us concluded that that was the correct title.
Well, it's certainly an energetic title, and so I can sense that energy around it, and I think it speaks pretty profoundly to the text, to what the book is about. And I'd like to ask you, you talk about filial pietism and becoming genuinely human, and that may be it may take people a little bit of time to unpack some of that. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about how filial pietism intersects with the process of becoming a genuinely human being, and just open that up a little more for us, please.
Sure. Well, as I said in my presentation, I've concluded over time, spent a lot of years looking at this issue, is that damaged heritage, as grotesque as it's been over hundreds of years, that it couldn't exist in that form if it weren't for this excessive veneration of our past, which created the excuse and inoculated. And when I use us, I mean collectively, of course, in my history and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. That allowed us, looking in the past, to justify what we're doing today. And in many ways, the filial pietism is exactly the obverse of the genuinely human. Because the filial pietism is looking at that past and justifying what we're doing in sin and evil and the racism that we are perpetrating from generation to generation, while the genuinely human is to accept now the commonality of human beings and in many ways, the love and natural commitment of humans with each other. And that commonality far exceeds those marginal facets that I identified in my remarks. You know, the language, the accents, the customs, the traditions, the history, the skin color, and all the rest that are ineffectively marginal differences. But those are the differences that some American whites established for purposes of separating us. But we move, it is difficult to say what creates or causes one to move from the filial pietistic world view to the genuinely human. I use an example in my book. It's in the second chapter. It's my letter to Lonnie, who was my maternal grandfather. And I use Robert Penn Warren as an example of that movement from the filial pietistic world to the genuinely human. Because he was, you know, he went to Vanderbilt, he was from Kentucky. In his mid-20s, he was a member of the Southern Agrarian group of writers at Vanderbilt. And he wrote an article that was published with a number of the other Southern agrarians. And he wrote a piece talking about African Americans. And it was written as though you know, it was prose taken out of Gone with the Wind. It was just really a very significant racist kind of comment. But then over time, to move forward 25 years, and he is interviewing civil rights leaders, risking his own life, having these interviews in secret, and his house, according to his daughter, was targeted by the KKK. And this is somebody who it was an incremental process for Robert Penn Warren. There are those who move from filial pietism to the genuinely human through epiphanies, I have no doubt. But, you know, there's no question that he did it in an incremental process, but he got there. And that was, so there's a process by which people can move from this filio-pietistic worldview, the genuinely human, which was a fundamental basis of the relationship that Sheila Walker and I had and continue to have over the 6 years of our racial reconciliation, which is a highfalutin word for actually we are very close friends. Our families are now friends. Our spouses are friends. We have become a close-knit unit as two families has sort of merged in this reconciliation. And it is based solely on what Kierkegaard would call the genuinely human, in which I've incorporated in my own theological thinking. That's a long-winded response. I'm sorry, Catherine.
It's not that, no, because it's a complex idea, so it takes a while to get a handle on it, I think. And as I listen to you talk about it, because it's the second time we've had a fairly lengthy conversation about these concepts, and I think about the trapeze artist, that when you let go of one bar and you have to take the other one, and there's a little bit of time in there where you're hanging in the air. And I think that's part of what makes that journey feel treacherous to people, because you've got to let go. And for some time, you might maybe not real clear about what it's gonna be replaced with. So letting go of that veneration of bad, damaged history, while you kind of embrace a new way to think, can be really challenging. As somebody who's worked for 50 years doing racial healing work, I understand the difficulty in doing that, because it does require more than a fair amount of courage and willingness to risk take some. So, and I really do appreciate your bringing these kind of two frames into this discussion, because it gives people a place to stand, I think, as they're trying to figure out how to go forward. And speaking of going forward with your grandfather, I think that I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you work with this image of this loving man who took you under his wings when you were a little boy and was loving and kind and your grandfather, and then yet he was a murderer who went out and killed innocent people. And you somehow have to bring those two people, those two perceptions, into some kind of at least conversation. And so could you say a little more about that journey for you of doing that?
Yeah, in summary, I don't do it very well. I actually, at the beginning of the process, I think I was a little naive. I had thought, you know, at some point, maybe I can, if I go through the killing fields, I can I can sort of sense maybe what was a relationship between these two people. Because Lonnie was the singularly most important figure in my memory up until the time that I started to school, when my mother then brought my older brother and I under one roof. But I had lived with my maternal grandparents, and Lonnie had just retired from the Missouri Pacific Railroad, which coincidentally was up to its eyeballs in this massacre, as I outline in the book. I was somewhat naive about it, and then I began to really struggle over it. How do I relate those two people? And I haven't done it. In some ways, Sheila has done it much better than I have. She just she says, you know, people are born good, and yet there are bad circumstances that make good people do bad things. Mm-hmm. And that's why she could publicly say, you know, I have forgiven Lonnie more than Chester has. Mm-hmm. And so, and I can't say that I have forgiven Lonnie. I don't feel comfortable in making a representation that I have. Sheila is very peaceful in her ability to forgive Lonnie, and I'm not there. Now, the relationship obviously is different between me and my grandfather, and Catherine, you and I have talked a little bit about the difference between sort of an event forgiveness and acceptance, or the inability to accept this part of Lonnie in comparison to what I remember about him and his caring and love for me. I'm working on it, and I hope I get close to where Sheila is eventually, but I'm clearly not there, and I'm hopeful that I'm able to correct this or remedy it, but it hasn't occurred yet over the number of years since it's been 12 years since I first learned of his likely role in this, and so yeah, we'll see how future compare. But I would not presume to be near the place where Sheila is, although Sheila really helps me address this issue.
Yes, you know, Attorney Brian Stevenson at the Equal Justice Initiative, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, says that he's worked with a lot of people who have done really bad things, and he has concluded that nobody is the sum total of everybody is not the worst thing you've ever done. Whatever the worst thing is that you've done is not the sum total of you. And I think that's really helpful to think about in terms of situations like this. I also am struck by how difficult it is for white people to make peace with their relatives that don't move forward toward genuine humanity, as you have been talking about, because going forward is not just you going forward, it's you going forward and leaving your relatives behind, or being in this kind of conflict that you're describing. And it takes a lot of courage to choose to be in the conflict, you know, that you just might skip it because it's disconcerting. So the fact that you are walking on the path and holding those disparate pieces of Lonnie Birch in your hand and your heart, I think is an example of part of why this work is so complicated and complex. So And as a Black woman, I'm really honored to be walking alongside you
Thank
in
you.
that process, because
Thank
I
you.
think that's encouraging to us as African Americans to find white people with that kind of courage and willingness to be in that journey. I imagine that that might be something that Sheila would say too, that it's a gift. And sometimes I know it's difficult for white people to know what they contribute in this whole construct of racial healing and reconciliation. And that's one important piece, to be willing to live in that tension of waking up and getting on the path to becoming genuinely human. So I want to say here in front of these people, and as I say often to my white friends, I thank you for being on the journey, because that's, we're all pilgrims here trying to figure it out. So it's good. So I wonder.
Catherine, do you mind if I follow up on just one point?
Sure,
what
go
you're
ahead.
Talking about, and that is that, and I discussed this in the book. I grew up in a racist family in a racist region, and I realized, racism was really an important element. But I did not realize that that was so often the glue that held white families together.
Mm-hmm.
That the event of one or two members of families deciding to take a different course, of deciding to move toward the genuinely human, created such a fissure in that family, or in those families, demonstrating that there may have been nothing more important in that family than the cohesiveness that racism represented for those people.
Mm-hmm.
And it was as I came to that conclusion, it was shocking, it was depressing, but I could not get away from that representation, that it is, that conclusion of cohesiveness for individual families around the racist issue was so compelling for keeping the family together.
Mm-hmm. And
It's a terrible kind of perception, but I couldn't conclude otherwise.
that's an interesting observation, and it helps some in trying to understand the insidiousness of racism, because it appears that, we've been working at this now since I don't know how many years, and here we are in 2020 in this state that we're in at the present moment. And so it's difficult sometimes to understand what that root system really is, that seems so hard to get rid of. And so I think that what you just said certainly does contribute to that. And of course, as Black folks looking in on white people, we think that you have it all together and you've got everything going for you. And we don't realize that until we get to know white people, that really they're just like everybody else trying to figure it out, and don't know sometimes how to get on the right road. And so that's why it's so important for all of us to embrace each other in our humanity, so we can kind of get over these projections of superiority or inferiority, I think, too. So
right. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to knock you off course, but I just
that's no problem. I'm glad for us to have the conversation and the audience can eavesdrop. So I wanted to ask you one last thing, and then we'll probably just need to let other people get in the conversation, because I'm sure there'll be questions and comments that will enlarge our time together. I wonder if you could just talk for a little bit about Elaine now. I mean, we were there last year, though it seems like it was yesterday, for the placement of the marker in Helena to remember the massacred people. And what was that like for you?
Well, it was, in some ways, it was really a fulfillment of many years working on it. I mean, we started, I think the effort started in 2013, and there was resistance to it locally because soon after the massacre, the power structure within Phillips County had an alternative white narrative to the truth of it. I mean, there had been reports by the FBI and Justice Department that laid out clearly the major damage that had happened. But so many of the descendants, even now, of the white planters took a position that they had degraded the massacre to a skirmish and also that in fact it had been more of a black insurrection than it had been a white massacre. But we began the process some earlier point of bringing in acknowledged experts, of people who had written about this and knew the massacre in and out, and held open public meetings about it. It was an educational process which went well. But I bought into the position that a physical memorial caused people to come to an attempt at reconciliation that otherwise would have been lost. And I think all of us who worked on this, I was a co-chair of it, but we had many people working within the committee on this project, but we were all committed to the fact that it's truth before reconciliation. It's not accidental that the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa had it in that line. And that is clearly the case that we experienced. And also what is fascinating now is the way in which the African American community has dealt with the memorial. When all of these demonstrations and protests were occurring throughout the country in response to George Floyd's death, there were demonstrations in Phillips County. And where did they have those demonstrations? They had it at the memorial. And I think that shows something in terms of where people know that the truth of the past in terms of racism and the cheapening of African American lives, it's demonstrated by that memorial, and it has come to represent that. And we're pleased that has been a partial reaction to it, to that memorial. And so
that makes me happy to hear that, because of course, I was there as a participant in the program, and there were not as many Black people in the attendance as there should have been. Right. And there was a little bit of conflict with an alternative event in Elaine because people thought the memorial should be there instead of Helena. But it is encouraging to hear that perhaps people have gotten over some of that, and that the symbolism, the energy of the symbolism is greater than the energy of disparateness. Mm-hmm. And so it has brought people to the memorial in this time of trying to stand up and affirm the necessity for liberation. So that's encouraging. And it encourages me to think about the importance of symbols. I'm really into that, and knowing that symbols are important, but sometimes you forget how important or how that really works in real time. So I'm really glad to hear that. Do you have anything else, Chester, you want to say before we open up the discussion to the audience?
I guess the only additional thing that I would say is the following up on a comment that you made, that if we're going to deal with racism today in a way that departs from the past, it is the need to deal with it. I mean, I didn't participate in the Elaine race massacre. I don't feel guilt about that personally. On the other hand, I inherited the Elaine race massacre. It is part of who I am. And if I don't deal with it, if I sort of allow it to be this sort of subliminal reality to me and outside the world of my concentration, I am foisting it forward. To the extent we don't deal with those aspects of our inheritance, our racial inheritance, we effectively are sidestepping it and allowing it to move forward for another generation, for another cycle to occur. And it is that need to stop this cycle, this perennial, or generational cycle that is part of the history of this country's racism. And therefore our past must be dealt with. If not dealt with, we've effectively forced it forward. And I would just like to make that comment. Thank you.
I think that's so true, and thank you. So Owene, are you going to conduct the question and answer time?
I will. We've got several questions in the chat box. And if it's all right with everybody, I'll just read them. And the first one is from Bobby O'Connor. She says, please speak to the slippery slope we encounter when, as whites, we depend on African Americans to help us forgive us. Say more about our need to do our own work and forgive ourselves and move beyond our guilt and move to create change.
Or do you want me to cover that, or Catherine, or?
You go first.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not so sure we can forgive ourselves. Not if it depends, you know, I mean, in part it's what your own damaged heritage is, but you know, folks who come and say, you know, well, I'm a first generation American, and so I'm not really into this racial issue. You come to the shores of the United States, you're part of the damaged heritage in that relationship of black and white. And I've concluded that over time, we have built up such a thick patina of our inability to tap into our humanity, and I'm really talking about whites. Tap into that, it would take nearly a complete force of nature for us to be able to forgive ourselves for our own past. I think I think we all knew, we've all known that the only way that we really are forgiven is to be forgiven by those we have made our victims. And this requires a relationship between blacks and whites that is so consequential that it has to be articulated as a major priority. I mean, I have a personal issue that I think there's too much institutionalization in trying to deal with racism. I think that we haven't, people of goodwill haven't broken out of institutions enough to join blacks and whites to deal with race on a consequential manner that is a personal one-to-one relationship. And I don't think that has been a priority. And in the context of these personal one-to-one relationships, I think the issue of forgiveness has got to be at the top of the list. It is, you know, as I said, King used the weapon of love. And I think that what he was talking about, he didn't use the word forgiveness, but I think that's exactly what he was referring to. And we whites who have collectively had this background do need to look at African Americans for a guidance to humanity, that we really don't have the ability to forgive ourselves in the absence of participation and relationships with those who we have inflicted.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is that I feel very deeply the necessity to practice myself and to encourage other people to practice acceptance too. I mean, you are who you are what you are, and you know, I'm a big woman. I'm not going to be 5 feet tall and weigh 120 pounds. That's never going to happen. So I need to just be willing to live in that reality, in that truth. Now, can I be smaller? Yes. Can I be fit? Yes. So if you're white, you have inherited this country, this history, this heritage, and there's not anything you can do about that until you decide the parts of it that are untenable, you can do something about, and you will. So, you know, I think acceptance helps so much, and canaming helps, to name the stuff. You know, James Baldwin said that we can't fix everything we can name, but we won't fix anything that we don't name. Mm-hmm. So I think I think that's really important. And I think that, you know, forgiveness is a funny energy system. Acceptance is a funny energy system too. It took me a long time to get to the point of accepting myself as a Black woman in this country, because being a Black woman in this country was an unacceptable thing to be. It was not, the country didn't want me to be who I was put on the earth to be. And so trying to figure out how then do I live involved accepting myself first as a worthy human being with all my foibles and everything, because I'm made in God's image and God loves me. And that, it's hard when you know, if you can step back a little bit and separate yourself enough to know you are a person and you can make choices. You don't have to be held hostage to the filial pietistic way of looking at the world, but you have inherited it by virtue of being in a country constructed upon a white supremacist paradigm. It's so complicated. That's the thing. And I think that people get caught up in this microwave culture that we have of looking for oversimplified remedies to very complex issues. And so I think it's real important to really work with that. And I think in the church, I think we can do this in the church. I think that's why I insist on doing my work of racial healing in the church, because I believe, because we are committed to God, that it can give us a space that allows us the ability to do this really hard work of excavating ourselves and waiting on God to help us put ourselves back together. It's complicated though, and I think we don't like the complexity.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add a footnote, sorry, just a real quick footnote on that. some people have asked me, what do you expect, what do you want for this book to achieve? And going to your quote from Baldwin in your comments, Catherine, I have laid out a series of words and concepts that I'm hopeful that will become part of the lexicon and the language of racial discussion. I don't, I want to see filial pietism be part of it. I want to see the genuinely human be part of it, because it is only, I think, when we do call these things by their name, that a consensus begins to develop around what the issues are, as opposed to we end up in sort of accusatory or blind alleys. And there's a review of the book that's coming out in the not too distant future, and the title of the review is Call It By Its Name. And that's really, the person who wrote it, we didn't have a discussion about, but I thought it was a way of dealing with. I'm just hopeful that we do go through the process of refining those elements that we can come to an agreement about collectively as a culture, that drives the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. And that's the ultimate point that we want to arrive at. So I just wanted to add that point, sorry.
Good. Thank you. This comes from the upper right-hand corner of our screen. It's either from Dean Kate or from Nancy. When racial injustices of the past have not been acknowledged, how does that prevent us from healing? Many are saying just move on. Please explain why it is impossible to move forward without telling the truth about the past.
You or me, Catherine?
Well, I'll start. We can trade off with being first, I guess. The biggest thing, the biggest response I have to that is that most of the injustices of the past are not past. They're still happening. As we sit here in this conversation this morning, too many things are the way they've always been. To quote Brian Stevenson again, Brian says, slavery never ended, it just evolved. So we have a 21st century rendition of slavery in this country in terms of the spirit and mentality and all of that. And so that's part of the problem. You can't fix what you are denying and still practicing and then call yourself gonna do something about it. I mean, that's sort of like, how you do a diet when you're on the diet, but you're eating everything that mitigates against, you're trying to lose weight, but you're eating and I do this, I refer to this because I've struggled with my weight all my life. So I know how we play games with ourselves. So, I'm just gonna have this little bit and that little bit and another little bit, but I'm trying to lose weight. Well, that's what we do about racism. We're trying to overcome this little bit and that little bit, but over here we're practicing systemic racism in the justice system, in the education system, in the political system, in the economic system, but you can go in this restaurant, so you ought to be feeling like you're free now. Well, that's just hypocrisy. That's why the past has to be, it has to not only be acknowledged, it has to be stopped. So.
Well, I'll add comment on that. When I was writing this book, I spent time in Phillips County. And one African-American man said, we're talking about the massacre. And he said, what we've done is swept this thing under the rug, but we then keep tripping over the rug. And I think that describes eloquently one of the reasons that we just can't forget about that. We can't forget about these events. They continue to pop up even when we don't know why they are popping up. I think that, based upon the aftermath of the massacre and the fear in the African American community about even talking about it. I mean, there were notices sent out by the white plutocrats in Phillips County, sent notices out throughout the county to African Americans, stop talking about it. And it is, and obviously that affected the way in which blacks and whites dealt with each other, not just with this event. And so there are the impacts of sweeping it under the rug, but there's also those impacts of tripping over the rug, where you wonder how people respond in certain ways. What is driving the way in which people respond to each other, blacks and whites, or even people of the same race, in the context of a community that has gone through this sort of diabolical event. And in the absence of addressing those issues, it's impossible for those communities to really come to an understanding of their past and the way in which the past impacts practices and relationships today. And so.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've got time for just a couple more. From Catherine Bissett, our bookstore manager. Are either of you familiar with the work of Jeffrey Canada and the Harlem Project? Do you think this is a model that could be replicated in other cities, communities to address the generational poverty of many African Americans? Could this be a form of repatriation for these past sins of racial injustice?
I'm not familiar with it. So.
I'm familiar with Jeffrey Kennedy and his work in the school system, I think, but I'm not sure if that's the same thing you're talking about. So can you say a little more about what the project is?
Catherine?
Me unmute.
There you go.
Yes, what the Harlem Project, I heard a presentation probably about 5 years ago at the Bridge of Northeast Florida in Springfield. And it was on the book that Paul Tuff wrote about the project. And what this is it's a very comprehensive approach to education, but also just all sorts of social training and assistance and support that begins really, I think it began like, even at birth, and just to support the child, all the children in the program all the way through school. But the idea of grooming these children to go on to college, establish a career, just giving them what they were not going to be able to receive at home due to their family circumstances.
Okay, so he started this in Harlem though, right?
Yes, that's right.
So I'm remembering the correct thing. So of course, I mean, I think that's an incredible model. I think one of the biggest shortcomings that we have with all of our efforts to do something about dismantling racism is that we never come up with a comprehensive plan. We just love putting Band-Aids on cancers rather than doing surgery, so that you can't do that. I mean, like right now we want to put a Band-Aid on the policing cancer so we can get on with it, instead of saying we have to redo this. We have to reconstruct how we do public safety in this country. We need to reconstruct how we do education. It's a sin and a shame the way we do education, particularly for poor kids, Black and brown and Native kids, and poor white kids. They're all getting short shrifted because, and it's not like we don't know. It's we don't care. We don't care enough to come up with a comprehensive plan. So Kennedy's plan is great, but it can't exist because we didn't fund it, right? Because when we find something that really does work and makes a difference, we don't fund it. I mean, we'll fund it for a little while and then we don't fund it anymore. And it just makes me crazy as an educator. I've taught at the college level, and I just think that there is no excuse for the sorry way that we do stuff here with the amount of intelligence and money that we have in this country. There is no excuse for us to be in the mess we're in because we have the capacity to fix stuff, and then we just won't do it. You know, we just quit somewhere. So I think you're right that we could make up for a whole lot of the deficits from slavery by having a comprehensive way to educate Black kids so that they actually have all of what they need when they get to be grown-ups to function in the society and be productive, rather than what we are getting now, which is a lot of substandard education and a lot of brokenness. And instead of building prisons for little Black kids, we should be fixing the education system. So, you know, it makes me very mad that we would build prisons and have prison beds for little kids failing third grade and not be trying to figure out how to keep them out of prison if they're failing third grade. So I think the attitude of, you know, giving up or deciding where they should go is just, it's horrible. And I think that you're right, that program is an excellent model.
There are lots of good questions in the chat box, and I think all of you have access to the chat box. So I would really encourage you to look at them and maybe be in conversation with one another about them. But Steve Tocknell's got one that's pretty good right here that comes after Catherine's. Did Lonnie ever ask anybody for forgiveness?
No. My Lonnie apparently was not a very spiritual person. And I did mention, I think, in here in my presentation that he was also a member of the KKK. But I remember the stories told about when his health started to fail, which was soon after I left him, and joined my mother and my older brother. People asked him where he would like to be buried, and he said, well, you know, we're just like dogs, just throw me out in the backyard. And so he was, you know, he wasn't of, apparently he wasn't of a nature to express himself very well in that respect. Although I have taken a little bit different view of Lonnie since in my relationship, our relationship with Sheila and her family. She believes that, you know, because I lived with him in a very formative period of my life, and he was my 24-hour, I mean, the family, at least I later heard that the family said I was his 24-hour a day retirement project. That she has concluded that he was a loving and caring man, and that I learned a lot from him emotionally in that way. And as I look back over time, I think that's true. But there's another aspect that Sheila uses, which I find interesting. She says that Lonnie he was not able to understand the importance of the genuinely human, that it was something that evaded his life. Even though he was a loving and caring person, it was not to the point that he did not know how to deal with the genuinely human. It was something he couldn't do. And she may be right about that. I'm just saying that the folklore in the family is that Lonnie was, a little bit of a hard nut in terms of his exterior, and certainly he was agnostic, and that was part of his persona. But on the other hand, he couldn't have been more loving and caring for me. That's I know I'm painting a fairly complex picture here, but no, I don't think he ever asked for forgiveness.
I think we're going to have to wrap up, but I would commend to you Greg Coughlin's comments in the chat box, and then his reference to a website of Jacksonville's Harlem Project. So Catherine, don't miss that. There'll be some explanations there for you. And I think Chester is going to close us with a prayer. And I would like that to be the end of our time together. So I want to thank each of you for being a part of this very holy conversation, hard conversation, one that we hope, as I said, will be the beginning of many hard conversations that we plan to be a part of at the Cathedral and around Jacksonville. And I pray that as we go out from this time together, we will go out into the world continuing the search for truth and reconciliation in all that we do and say. Though the work is hard and the conversations are hard, it is clearly what we have been called to do at this time. Chester.
Okay. I just make a couple of comments. The prayer that I'm going to read comes from this. It's called let's see, here it is. It's the Litany of Offense and Apology. On October the 4th, 2008, the Episcopal Church apologized for its role in transatlantic slavery and related evils. And it was the litany was, which are invocations and solicitation, not solicit, but presence of pleadings to God for the salvation of the church and members of the church, for what the church did in the past in the furtherance of slavery and related evils. And there were 8 pages to it, and I'm gonna read the last prayer. And I wrote the litany, and it was the litany that was used for that event. And we broke out the various pieces related to racism and the support of slavery, weakness, subjugation, neglect, complicity, arrogance, and complacency. And we prayed and invoked God's Spirit for forgiveness to the church, covering each of those items. But this is the ending, and I'll read it now. This is to consolidate all of the concepts that went before it in this 8-page document. O God, may we, the church, by acknowledging manifold sinfulness and the support of slavery and its associated evils, hereby pledge to adopt a new spirit in application for freedom and respect, leading to redemption and reconciliation. And may we, the church, henceforth and ever, value and love others as we do ourselves. O God, may you forgive the past and enliven the church with a transformed and invigorated heart, constant courage, and purposeful wisdom to effect your enduring will. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all so much for being with us. Catherine and Chester.
It's great. You all take care and God bless you all.
And to you all, thank you. Thank you for having me.